What if I told you that there's more to the David and Goliath story than you might know? 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 48 and 51 reads, When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. But you might not have known that David had to cut off his head. Now you may be asking me, what does that mean? Let me explain, but first, let's go back to the conquest of the land of Canaan. Goliath was a remnant of the Nephilim in which the Israelites were supposed to eradicate but didn't. Let's read Deuteronomy chapter 20 verses 16 through 18. But of the cities of these peoples, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God had commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. But they couldn't fully complete this task. So why could they not drive out the Philistines and the surrounding areas? The first was military advantage. In Judges chapter 1 verse 19 it says, So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. The next verse is Judges chapter 1 verses 34 and 35. It says, And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down into the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, in Shaalbim. Yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. And then Joshua 15 verses 63, it says, As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Disobedience and consequences. Judges chapter 2 verses 2 and 3 says, And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. Also, Yahweh was using them to test the newer Israelites with war so they wouldn't get complacent. As we read in Judges chapter 3 verses 1 and 4, it says, Now these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who have not known any of the wars in Canaan. This was only so that the generations of the children of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known, namely, 5 lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites who dwell in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon to the entrance of Hamath, and they were left, that he might test Israel by them, to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. The giants of the land had multiple races that are mentioned in the Bible, but the initial race seems to be the individuals called the Rephaim. The word Rephaim comes from the Hebrew word Rapha. In the Strong's Concordance, it's 7498 Rapha, which means to heal, to cure, or to restore. The Hebrew word Rapha primarily means to heal or to restore to health, and it is used in the context of physical healing as well as a metaphorical or spiritual healing. So this has also been loosely translated as the Walking Dead, implying that these ancient zombies commonly cheated death. The other races of giants mentioned in the Bible that are likely a genetic offshoot of the Rephaim are the Anakims, which mean long-necked and tall, and the Emims, which means terrors. So the giants in the Promised Land were all tall, terrible, and healers? Well, assuming that the Nephilim giants are not solely human, but are demigod-like offspring of angels and humans, they likely possess superhuman qualities in which we derive a lot of our myths and legends. All mythological creatures which have been since derived from the Nephilim are very difficult to kill and have very specific ways in which they are to be taken out. Werewolves, vampires, and Greek demigods all require special circumstances to fully slay. You have myths about Jack the Giant Killer in British lore resulting in beheadings to ensure death. You have Thor of Norse mythology that had to strike the heads of the giants in battle with Mjolnir to ensure death. You have Beowulf who had to behead Grendel. You have Perseus that had to behead Medusa. And you have various myths of ogres that required beheading in various myths. Now, could these biblical Nephilim require a beheading to ensure their death? Battles with giants in the Bible do not go into much detail outside of David and Goliath. But let's look at what other Jewish texts say about another famous giant in the Bible, Og of Bashan. That he was cut down by his ankles and that Moses used an axe to strike his head, likely inferring a beheading. Not only did David cut off Goliath's head to show an irrefutable victory, but this was likely a necessity due to the Nephilim heritage. But that's not all. Genesis 3:15 states, "I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." The offspring of the woman is ultimately Jesus Christ, and the offspring of the serpent are the Nephilim. So if David is a representation of Christ, then Goliath is a representation of the seed of the serpent, which is the Nephilim offspring. Now David, as a picture of Yeshua, strikes the head of the serpent. Then what does he do? 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 54 reads, "And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem." Various medieval Christian texts will attest to David burying the head of Goliath in a hill outside of Jerusalem, with this hill later being coined the Hill of the Skull, which translates to Golgotha or Calvary. Now, is it a coincidence that Golgotha sounds like Goliath from Gath? Now, David buried the head of the serpent at Golgotha, and 1,000 years later, Yeshua was pierced through his Achilles tendon, his heel, directly over this site, fulfilling the prophecy of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. But these are still just a foreshadowing of the final battle. The first Antichrist and post-flood giant Nimrod required a beheading for his death from Isaac's son Esau, according to the book of Joshua. The final seed of the serpent and last Antichrist will not fall to a head wound. As we read in Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, one of the heads of the beast appeared to have received a fatal wound, but its fatal wound was healed, and the whole earth followed after the beast in amazement. Now this Antichrist is a souped-up version of the healing ones, the Rephaim, from the Old Testament. Why wouldn't the final seed of the serpent, the final Nephilim, the Antichrist, be able to regenerate like his ancestors, but even better? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8 reads, "And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." In Revelation chapter 19, verse 15, it says, "Now out of his mouth," this is Jesus, "goes a sharp sword, with that in it he should strike the nations." So the final blow will be the double-edged sword word of the Lord, which destroys the Antichrist at his second coming, not a beheading. With no ability to regenerate or be reborn, or linger on the earth like the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, as they will be cast into the lake of fire forever. Decapitation was necessary to destroy the seed of the serpent as prophesied in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and it is in no coincidence that the Bible includes this detail after Goliath was dropped from the stone. With all of this foreshadowing the victory of Yeshua on the cross with his first coming, and the victory over the ultimate seed of the serpent at his second coming.